Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to Blackburn Cathedral this evening. My name's James Lawrence. I'm the Canon Missioner here, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you. I'm really glad to see all the Anglicans sitting at the back. We know where we like to sit, so excellent, good, pleasure. It's a joy to welcome you here, to open our doors this evening to so many people from across the Christian family. Let me just give a few quick notices, things to keep in the back of your mind. Refreshments will be available throughout the evening and during the interval, so if you'd like something else to eat or drink, they'll be available in the south transept. People will be taking photos this evening and throughout the conference, so if that's a problem for you, please do let me know, and I'll make sure that you're not involved in any social media and the like. If you have a booklet, please hold on to that booklet for tomorrow, because we've got a fantastic amount of people coming to this conference, and oh ye of little faith, I did not print enough booklets. So please do hold on to yours. Lastly, if you have any dietary requirements that you haven't let us know about, please do so this evening. Speak to Julie at the back, and she'll make sure that you're looked after. I'd like to begin by acknowledging those people who have been instrumental in making this conference happen. Julie Eatwell is a volunteer with us at the Cathedral, and she has been instrumental in helping me make this happen, and Daniel James. The two of them have worked closely with me on the details and the paperwork that would otherwise drown me, so I'm very grateful for them, and to Checks and Grays for their hospitality this evening. Jesus promises that where two or three are gathered in his name, he's present among them. So before we do anything else, let's acknowledge Christ's presence here with us. He is the one who leads us into all truth and unity. As we reflect on the legacy of Nicaea, as we ask how its witness sheds light on the debates that are facing the church today, and as we enter into what I hope will be some honest disagreement in love, the theme of our conference, it's my prayer that Christ amongst us will guide and inspire us in all that we do in the next 24 hours. One of the key markers of an ecumenical conference is the people who are in the room. Representation matters. Not only the traditions that are present, but the people who are gathered to embody the wisdom and life of those traditions. It's the diversity itself that is the gift of the Spirit, and it's what enables us to speak and listen and learn fruitfully together. The richness of this gathering here is seriously only possible because of Anton and his well-worn little black book. I'm sure most of us are here because he nagged us to be so, and real credit therefore is due to him in drawing us together, and I want to say publicly how much I've enjoyed working with him in putting this conference on. So Anton, thank you to your partnership in hosting this conference with us and for working with me so closely. It's been a pleasure, and I'll hand over to you for your welcome.
How good and pleasant it is when the people live together in unity. And as I look out at the audience tonight, what joy it brings. It's one of those Pentecost moments when you have a glimpse of the whole church coming together as one, and that's what all these occasions are about. I want to return the compliment. It's been a great joy to work with Canon James. I do know his name. And it's so exciting to be here with you this evening. I'm the County Ecumenical Officer for Churches Together in Lancashire, and I'm going to hand over to our chair for this evening. Our chair is the Reverend Dr. Peter Colwell, who is the Deputy General Secretary of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. But even more important, he's the chair of Churches Together in Lancashire. And in both those capacities, Peter, we welcome you, and we hand ourselves over to you for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anton. Thank you all for your welcome. Working in Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, I organise a lot of conferences. It's nice to participate in one that you've not had to worry about the organisation. So my grateful thanks to James and Anton for all the hard work and all their team behind the scenes. I must say that when we began this year of celebrations of the Council of Nicaea, I wondered how it would turn out ecumenically. And I have been astounded by the the depth and breadth of the ecumenical engagement and some of the very energized and exciting discussions that we've had within Churches Together in England and Churches Together in Britain and Ireland and elsewhere. And I hope this continues to contribute to that ongoing deep ecumenical engagement around this very important anniversary. I'm going to introduce to you now our keynote speaker. You can read a full biography of Professor Rachel Muers in your brochure. I warmly encourage you to do so. I'm not going to read that, but needless to say that Rachel is the Chair of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh and a member of the World Council of Churches Faith and Order Commission. The Faith and Order Commission also includes full membership of the Catholic Church and has been deeply engaged with this anniversary. And so, Rachel, we are very honoured to have you with us, and we are looking forward very much to what you have to say to us this evening.
Thank you. Good evening. They've given me this microphone, so I'm hoping that between it all I'm heard just enough and not too much. I've also given my slides into the hands of James, so I'm hoping. Here's the thing, what has remained absolutely consistent in ecumenical conferences for 1,700 years is that all the participants are made to line up and have a slightly awkward picture taken somewhere near the end. And this, you will see, is the one that they did at the Council of Nicaea, and ours will be done later, and then AI enhanced to give you the full icon effect. That's just so that you know the right person is talking to you. And here are my slides. I want to suggest, as I've been asked to, some ways of reading the Council of Nicaea and its consequences for the ecumenical context of 2025. So I'm going to talk about doing theology together from a broken body, this theology from a broken body. I'm going to talk a bit about power and theology and power games, and I'm going to talk a bit about trust. But before I pick up those three sections, I want to say something about how I understand the work of ecumenical theology. And this is something I developed for my lovely friends and colleagues on the Faith and Order Commission when we were beginning the next phase of our work. I reflected in the first meeting of that group on Psalm 122:1. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." I start with gladness, and I wanted to start with gladness for the WCC because of being in a context when you're talking about disagreement, and also because ecumenical efforts can, let's face it, sometimes feel like a lot of hard work for nothing. So it's as well to be reminded at the start that peace and unity is not a pious hope nor a pipe dream. It is a real place, the house of the Lord. If it were not so, we would not be filled with gladness at the call to go there. It would just be another pointless journey for nothing. But it's real, yeah? And neither I, nor they, nor you make or control it. It's not our house, it's the house of the Lord. The next thing that's really important to me, this is an ecumenical text, is that it's really important that I hear about the house of the Lord from them. There is the givenness of the goal of the house of the Lord, and there is also the givenness of the neighbour, or the stranger, or the forebear, who has something to tell me about it. I hear their call, and I'm glad. I receive it as a call to me, and as a call towards the house of the Lord. And I don't just recognise the call, this is what happens with the psalm, I pick it up in my own voice. We respond from the heart, from the truth of who we are and where we are, to the truth that's spoken to us. We hear it and we respond from who we are, from where we are. Yeah. And in this process of calling and calling again, new relationships are formed. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go." The I and the they have become us. Not only at the end of the journey, not only way up there, but in the journey, on the journey, we can envisage the process as open-ended, expanding the community step by step. Someone else hears this call, this song, and is drawn to it and reinterprets it, and then somebody else hears an echo of the same call and follows it, and steps quietly onto the path and joins the journeying community. I've started moving. I said I'd stay put at the lectern. I'm terribly sorry. So, my first intention in relation to Nicaea, the council and its documents, is to hear it as a call, like the call of the sun. I read its creed as a call towards attention to and trust in the mystery of God. And I read the council as the setup of this conference invites us to do, as a call towards learning about unity in the midst of disagreement. And I'm going to get on to why this is really hard, the struggles of and with Nicaea, but I want to start with the basic orientation. We're hearers and responders and fellow travellers. We're not judges of the past, and we're not passive products of the past. We're part of this. And I don't think there's anything there that sounded particularly like Quaker theology. Spoiler alert, I'm a Quaker. But Quaker participation in the ecumenical movement, which has been we've been very generously welcomed in, has generally been on the basis of being recognisably and actively on a shared path, on a shared journey, drawn and attracted by a shared promise, and engaged in a shared process of hearing and listening. And that's been a way of allowing the ecumenical movement to relate to a community who, for a lot of good reasons, don't do creeds. And maybe this whole paper, I think it is a long-winded way of accepting the corresponding obligation, which I take very seriously, to listen to fellow travellers, past and present. And so, having named a difference, it's time to talk about Christian theology as theology from a broken body. So Nicaea, that's what's brought us all here. The First Ecumenical Council. It's so closely associated with Constantine, right, with the power of a Christian ruler and with the power of Christian leaders, these guys, that it's easy to forget that I think all the main participants will have had recent memories of the widespread persecution of Christians when they were there in the council. Athanasius was a bit young, but he's not a major participant. So the main guys, they are all remembering persecution. Memories, as we know, memories of the martyrs and of those who'd held to their faith even under torture, were actively fostered by the new regime. This is Paul of Neo-Caesarea, who famously has scars of torture on his hands, and the emperor comes up and kisses them, and it's this very symbolic moment. Because the idea was a faith worth dying for was bound to be worth fighting for. That was what Constantine wanted people to think. I mean, that's not my logic, but it's common enough logic through Christian history. The thing I care about is this was a gathering held under the shadow of violence and trauma. And, one of the key conflicts that they were actually trying to resolve, a little sideshow from what we now think of as the main event, was the Milesian schism relating to the attitudes of those who'd recanted their faith under persecution. So they were actually actively arguing about the aftermath of the great persecutions. And even the Arian controversy, there's a plausible argument that part of what's going on there is it's about Christians as monotheists trying to work out how they held the line in the context of massive pressure from a polytheistic context, right? So theology under immense social and cultural pressure. So when we look around at the Council of Nicaea, if this is the Council of Nicaea, the Christian body gathered there is not just under threat from arguments arising in the present, it's deeply scarred in ways that probably can't even be named and recognized from what it's already been through. The bodies of some of the bishops have torture marks, but more than that, the conflicting Christian identities in that room have been formed amid grief and bitterness and anxiety and any of the other responses that human beings have to violent and uncertain times. The Christian body, if you like, has built up scar tissue. And I think we now can probably all think of examples of how external pressures on church communities, deeply traumatizing ones like global pandemics, or grinding everyday ones like rapid decline in numbers or influence, turn internal conflict sharper or more intractable, as the external pressure makes the internal disagreements. I'm not trying to argue that that background explains everything about what happens at the council. I don't think it does. But I draw attention to it because I think it deepens our understanding of the kind of unity or peace that might be looked for at Nicaea. Because I think Nicaea was, among other things, some sort of attempt to confront together the reality of being members of a broken body. It's not about papering over a few cracks in what's basically a reasonably united or harmonious whole. And it also wasn't about just splitting off and enabling separate groups to sort out some boundary issues and then go back to ignoring each other. It's somehow about people who belong together but can't currently live together, trying to figure out what they're going to do next. I think that's part of what Nicaea is, and that doesn't feel entirely alien, right? My key idea about that, theologically, is that recognizing shared suffering and recognizing conflict or division as a shared problem, as the mess we are all in, is already an enormously significant step into peace and unity that is already a gift of God. The ability to know you've got the problem, that's already a gift, don't undervalue it. Because sometimes in the current situation of world Christianity, it may be as far as we can get, yeah? A collective lament for what's broken us and is still breaking us. Sitting together at the foot of the cross in the midst of the deeply entrenched multi-generational consequences of violent conflict and other collective manifestations of human sinfulness. But of course that place at the foot of the cross is not as far as it might seem from the house of the Lord. And the astonishing vision glimpsed in the modern ecumenical movement, and maybe somehow in the first ecumenical council as well, is that these differences born and sustained in violence and division, the scar tissue if you like, can by the grace of God come back as gifts we offer each other. That's what the ecumenical movement is. The ecumenical movement is born out of people killing each other years and years over, and then living with the aftermath of that, living with the scar tissue of that, and then somehow finding that out of that history we had not just wounds but also gifts. It's astonishing. But that way of looking at an ecumenical gathering, that it's an attempt to reckon together with the mess we're in, isn't on its own a very persuasive reading of what happened at Nicaea. So that was the nice version of the story. Now, here's the other thing, right? This is the section about power, because, as is acknowledged in the setup for this conference, Nicaea happens because the Christian emperor wanted a united church, and however much sense that made theologically, it's also true that a united church was in the emperor's interests as he struggled to consolidate his own power. And as we also know, power struggles before, during, and after Nicaea combined to ensure that sporadic persecution of Christians didn't stop. It's just that Christians were now doing some of the persecuting. Right? Yeah, so Christians are still being persecuted, it's just they're both sides now. Yeah, and for that readings of Nicaea today, especially obviously in the church and theological circles I move in, are often very negative. Nicaea seems to play into and contribute to what the South African theologian Teddy Sakupapa calls the entanglement of imperial power and Christian orthodoxy. And the closer one looks at it, the more it looks like just another power game in which truth comes a long way below political expediency. And this is this image I thought you might like to see, because I learned while preparing this paper that the Council of Nicaea was made into a board game in 2021, precisely with the premise that these theological arguments were just another power game. Yeah? So I'm just going to read you a bit from the online review because it's great. Here's a quote. Whether a position ends up accepted orthodoxy or damnable heresy, sorry, pardon the, it's in the review, has nothing to do with theology and everything to do with politics, with personal ambition, petty rivalries and social dynamics. I was kind of a bit, I don't know what you think about the idea of making a board game out of the Council of Nicaea. I thought it was a bit disturbing. And then I wondered if it was really any worse than making games about murdering people with lead piping or, you know, making a fortune on the London property market. I don't know. Anyway, still, even before I found that the Nicaea had actually been turned into a literal power game, I did have a song stuck in my head as I reflected on the council. It's Aaron Burr in Hamilton singing about the murky political compromise, and James very kindly gave us a shout out to this even in the first introduction, right? No one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. No one really knows how the parties get to yes, the pieces that are sacrificed in every game of chess. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. Of course, as you know, because you all know the show, right, Burr is the villain of the piece. This is the baddie's song. And the show doesn't completely buy into his total cynicism about how politics works. But the show also can't deny the basic point that you can never discount the particular interpersonal relationships involved, which also means you can never take away power, right? In the end, everything depends on who's in the room, and also who sets the agenda, how exactly these various complex characters interact on the day. And so perhaps with Nicaea, scholar David Gwynn puts it, I'm not a historian, so I'm always glad when historians say things like, quote unquote, uncertainty surrounds almost every aspect of the council and its proceedings. And you're like, thanks mate, that's what I need historians for. Yeah. No one really knows how the game is played, we just assume that it happens. What is fairly clear is that it's a very carefully managed agreement, and the emperor does have a lot to do with setting the stage. And for many readers of Nicaea, including for many Christians, this imperial setting of the scene, combined with the oddity of a couple of hundred men sorting out Christianity for 1,700 years to come, makes Nicaea a problem. Not just that so many people and categories, half the human race or whatever, aren't in the room where it happens, but that this is the worry people have, is that it's entirely reducible to political interests, right? To an exercise of reinforcing the powers that be. So what I'm interested in is how we handle that as theologians, how we handle that worry and the fact of the power in the room, right? Let's assume, as Hamilton the show, and actually the character does, that every attempt at structured dialogue in pursuit of unity, as for this conference, or engaging with difficult issues or facing differences, is going to be, it's always just going to be, a complicated mixture of serious truth-seeking and power plays and multiple conscious and unconscious biases and the sheer contingency of who happens to be in the room where it happens. I take it Nicaea, the council, the original council, is no exception. That everybody involved was sincerely believing they're seeking truth and unity at least some of the time, and out for their own interests at least some of the time, and repeatedly misunderstanding and misrepresenting themselves, each other, and the truth. Sin happens in every room, including everywhere in Christian history. Now, I don't believe that invalidates Nicaea, either in terms of its discernment or in terms of its usefulness as an example of dialogue. To be precise, I don't think I'm entitled to say just because Nicaea involved a lot of grubby politics, I can ignore it, has nothing to do with me. And that is even though I am, for the record, fully committed to a church tradition that turned away from creedal formulations because of the persecuting spirit that followed in their wake. Including, of course, there was the persecution of the supporters of Nicaea when the politics changed. So that's, and a tradition, Quakers, right, that turned even more decisively away from allying Christianity with state power backed with military force. Nicaea is really not our kind of thing. But I don't think that I'm entitled to say it's got nothing to do with me, because here I am in an ecumenical space. I trust that Nicaea is some kind of call to me that has something to do with a shared journey to the house of the Lord. And that's not, I'm afraid, because I trust Constantine or Alexander or Athanasius or anyone else involved. We don't need to judge or vindicate our predecessors of faith. We don't need to set them up on pedestals or knock them down. I take Nicaea as a call because I trust God to work through and despite people's best efforts. And not just once as a one-off in the room where it happens, but in the whole process of reception and response. I trust God to work through and despite people's best efforts in these complex, power-ridden, multiply scarred ecumenical spaces. So I do need to end by speaking about trust. Perhaps the designer of that board game assumed that theology would always have to be just a power game, because maybe they assumed that nobody knows the truth about God anyway, either because there's nothing there to know or because God is hidden, perhaps. I sometimes think at least some beginner students of theology assume the opposite, assume that this whole process of agreeing a creed was some sort of like guess what's in God's mind puzzle for the assembled bishops to solve, and hence this was the only way it could possibly have turned out. And, you know, sometimes we teach theology as though that was how it worked, and that's probably a bad idea. We need the historians to come and remind us about the messy complexities of the room where it happens. To state perhaps the blindingly obvious, the heart of the creed and the heart of the question of Nicaea is who God is. Or more specifically, looking at the first word of the creed, who is this God in whom we put our trust? That's the belief, trust, faith word, yeah. After all, the controversial bit of the creed isn't we believe in God, it's what comes next. I suggested earlier that part of the question here was what kind of monotheists Christians are. You can frame it as a question about revelation, the question the Creed's trying to answer. What does it mean to say that God reveals God's own self in Jesus? Or you could read it as a question about salvation, but I'd say all of those are questions about who God is. And I'm suggesting that the answer to that question is not something that can be contained exhaustively in a form of words, although it clearly is something towards which words can direct us more or less well. The Creed speaks of who God is and puts Jesus at the center of who God is, not to narrow God down or to reduce God to the human. That's the whole point, right? That's the whole point, not to do that, or to define God. But, this is one way of reading it, to affirm that God makes God's self known, available and present, makes God's self known, available and present, just as inexhaustible mystery, as the one who is more than knowable, not less than knowable. And trust in God, as I've been alluding to it in this paper, is trust that God goes on being who God has already shown God's self to be. And we could say Nicaea is about trusting that God reveals God's self just as God is, and is present for us just as God is, caught up in the middle of all the power plays with their various petty or tragic or horrific consequences, all that stuff that the First Nicene Creed just sums up as he suffered. That suffering and healing presence for us and for our salvation doesn't detract one iota from the mystery of God. Conversely, there's nothing hidden in the mystery of God that's different from the God who's encountered in Jesus, right? And the confidence behind that core of affirmation seems to me to be the same confidence that enables honest engagement in Nicaea and in our time with difficulty and disagreement, including difficulty and disagreement about how we say or express or perform our faith. Have I got my next slide next? Yes, I have got my next slide yet. You've been very patient, we're nearly there. So here's the stuff people might want to argue. You can argue about all of it. But we can't, I think, say that this particular formulation, the First Nicene Creed of 325, is the only way to express or perform faith in the God to whom it points. And not just because, as we know, 325 doesn't give you what's now often called the Nicene Creed, so already we've got these complicated processes of reception and response and that. Questions remain well beyond the odd world of Quakers, I have to tell you, about what unintended consequences go along with the authority of the Nicene Creed, particularly in an age when the centre of Christianity's gravity has shifted away from Europe. For example, as one of my East Asian students asked me earlier this year, will Christian theology always have to speak Greek? I found that a genuinely interesting question when you stop and think about it. And the student who asked it wasn't necessarily committed to the answer no, right? So they're prepared to entertain the view that Christianity might just always have to speak Greek, that might be part of the historical contingency particularity, like Jesus is always going to have been a Palestinian Jew, and if you forget that or leave it out, you have done something really bad to Christianity. It might be that this kind of historical contingency is also built in, so Christianity will always have to speak Greek. But the student was making the point that the whole philosophical framework that makes the distinction between homoousios and homoousios important, or even comprehensible, is culturally specific. And the South African theologian whom I mentioned earlier goes further and draws attention to the way in which the same European philosophical frameworks that underpin Nicaea, the text, are also used to judge and often delegitimize indigenous knowledge outside Europe. So there's power games even when you start talking about cultural specificity. So there are questions about how, there are genuine live questions about how to handle, and I guess this is where I've tried to bring the conference, the non-negotiable facts of the contingency, the particularity, the who happens to be in the room where it happens, how does all this work, and slightly aside from that, the power games, and to respond in faith to the givenness of Nicaea, and that's where we are. Drawing attention to the contingency of Nicaea, and this is where I want to end, is not attacking the text or throwing it away. It's taking it very seriously as a call that needs responses. I'm suggesting that we can hear Nicaea, the text and the council, and the various different ways in which it's been received and taken up in the churches through the ages. We can hear them as our forebears saying to us in their own languages and places, let us go to the house of the Lord. And we can be glad that we're able to hear it. And I'm sure you're all now going to be glad that you can have some refreshments. I thank you for your attention.
the question around Greek. I'm deeply, as somebody who is deeply interested in the relationship of Judaism and Christianity, there's an awful lot to unpack there. Thank you very much. And much more besides, which we will do so in the questions from the discussions and the responses from the panel shortly. We're going to now have a shorter break than it says in your programme. Is that right, Anton? Yes, a short break of no more than 10 minutes. And then, so if you haven't had refreshments, quick run back there to get them, and then we will recommence with our distinguished panel. Thank you very much indeed. Friends, we're now ready to begin our responses from our distinguished panel. So, yes, you can. I'm not sure I've got a whole panel yet, but I have.
Six bodies, 6 chairs.
Okay, I'll take your word for it, Anton, as you're the real man in charge, but the power behind the throne. So we've got a lot to reflect upon, and to help us, we have our panel here. And I'm going to introduce to you, first of all, Father Andrew Louth, who is Professor Emeritus of Patristic and Byzantine Studies at the University of Durham.
Yeah, I just feel bad because...
Is this working for you?
Yeah.
Good.
Been told I missed my vocation.
First of all,
Pentecostal.
thank you to Professor Rachel Muers for a moving and searching keynote address. There's no need to summarize it here. Her words are ringing in our ears. From her invocation of the psalm verse, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord, through her recalling that many of the bishops gathered together at Nicaea bore signs of their suffering during the great persecution that had ended barely 20 years earlier, potentially compromising their closeness to imperial power and their need for trust in one another and the emperor, now styled the protector of the church. But the council didn't just meet. It came to some decisions about the date of Easter or Pascha, and there were then 20 canons issuing problems about the organization of the church with its newfound freedom, and the issuing of a creed. And if we are to take the measure of Nicaea, we need to reflect on all of this as we celebrate its anniversary, something that has signally not happened in most of the conferences held in this anniversary year. I've searched through a few lists of schedules and nothing about the canons. Let us inevitably briefly take these issues one by one. First, Easter and its date. The Nicene Synod put its seal on the virtually universal practice of the church that had established itself. Easter was to be celebrated on the first Sunday after the full moon following the Easter spring equinox, which ensured that Pascha, or Easter, was the Christian Passover, corresponding to the Jewish Passover, matching and fulfilling that Passover, but celebrating the resurrection of Christ, which is also celebrated weekly every Sunday. The decision about the date of Easter was not just about a date. It affirmed unmistakably that Christians are to be seen and to see themselves as the people of the resurrection. The 20 canons tackle various problems facing the organization of the church. There is no time to begin to explore this, which would take a course of lectures, not 500 words, save to observe that the church had been and was to continue to be modeled on the administrative structures of the Roman Empire, constituted by the cities with their own bishop, themselves grouped into provinces with metropolitan bishops, and larger groupings still modeled on the provinces called dioceses, eventually ruled by patriarchs. I'm not going to go into any detail, but ask a question. Is such a template suitable for the world that we live in now? Can we treat the world that we live in now as just an expanded Roman Empire? And the Creed. Eventually the Creed, as modified at the Second Ecumenical Council in 381, assumed a liturgical function, said or sung at every Eucharist or Divine Liturgy, at least in the West on Sundays. The Creed has 3 sections: on God the Father, the Lord Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, reflecting its origins in the baptismal confession of faith in the Trinity. Famously, there is insistence on the addition of the phrase applied to the Lord Jesus Christ, homoousion topatri, consubstantial or of one substance with the Father, affirming that the God revealed in Jesus Christ is identical with God the Father. He's not a second God or a secondary God, a different God. He is the same God. If we're to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea, we need to go further than its meeting as a synod and reflect on what it decided, which will require insight and courage. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Andrew. We're going to move to our next response from Sister Margaret Atkins, Canoness of St. Augustine in the community at Borbank Hall in Cumbria. Sister, we look forward to hearing what you have to say to us.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much to Rachel for your very lively introductory talk. I think what I wanted to do was begin by putting Nicaea, and particularly the Creed, into a larger ecclesial context. So as we know, the Council is part of a history of formal church meetings going right the way back to the Apostles, and I suppose you could say continuing up to this meeting here and now. The Creed itself had a long prehistory and a long post-history, we know, modified at the Council of Constantinople, then confirmed, both versions at Chalcedon, gradually being adopted in different places and different times, first in the baptismal liturgy, eventually in the Sunday liturgy of the majority of Christians across the world. There's been a lot of ink spilt over one specific clause, which led to notorious conflict, but it's more important perhaps to remember that many other substantial points that it made about God were widely agreed. And then the council was followed by a series of other councils, some local, some universal or would be universal. And today, almost all Christians recognize the appropriateness, at least of aspiring to meet in this way, which maybe in itself is an astonishing fact, shouldn't be taken for granted. And then I wanted to, if you like, second and pick up and thankful to Andrew for his points about the many things that were discussed apart from the Creed at Nicaea. It's the date of agreement on the date of Easter, agreement on how to respond to different schismatic groups, canons covering things like the selection, organisation and authority of the clergy, as well as topics like liturgy and penance. To sum that up, I'd say this reflects the fact that the council represented a wider community, one rooted in shared worship, worship that was focused on the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that the identity and continuity of this community was assured through a structured succession of leaders. Now, I'm an Augustinian sister, so you'll forgive me for a reference to St. Augustine, because I think he would have appreciated Rachel's focus on weakness and sin, the assembled bishops' collective need for healing, and the compromised nature of the political power that backed the decisions of the council. Augustine might have developed the point that God's work in us can overcome our sinfulness. Christ is both our doctor who heals us and our peace who unites us in his body, the church. So here in the church, There are saints as well as sinners, graced as well as compromised motives. And in the church, authority, which is a distinct kind of power, is bestowed on specific individuals for the purpose of building the body of Christ. And you can make a parallel point for secular authorities. So such church leaders are to be carefully and prayerfully selected and will be called to account for the exercise of their authority before God, which is why St. Augustine so often described his own episcopal responsibility as a burden. That was his favourite word for it. So I suggest that one of the things we need is a rich account of both secular and religious authority and their responsibilities under God if we're going to understand the church. And then finally, Rachel evoked trust. She said, I take Nicaea as a call because I trust God to work through and despite people's best efforts. Again, beautifully Augustinian. And I suppose I would want to go on and ask, why might we think that God was working here through this specific assembly? Why is Nicaea our focus? And so I suggest that the answer to that must involve trusting that God works through the concrete life of the community founded by Christ and focused on Christ under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We're already getting our Trinitarian theology implicit there. It's only that can enable us to speak with at least some precision and definiteness, even if at the same time with awe and humility, about what we're doing and what we're meaning when we worship together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sister Margaret. Can I just say at this point that the text of both Rachel's lecture and the responses will be made available afterwards. I know there's been some acoustic issues for some, so rest assured that you can go back to this text, these texts at a later date. We now move on to the Bishop of Blackburn, Bishop Philip North.
Somebody like Rachel doesn't really need words when she communicates so fabulously with her body. But Rachel's paper starts with that thrilling vision of Psalm 122 as the us invite the eye to the house of the Lord. But who is the Lord and who is the us? To answer those questions, we need God's self-revelation, which is just what we find in the psalm. He speaks on the holy mountain. He reveals himself through his word, and he opens up the way to the mountain, eventually through the saving work of his incarnate Son. That understanding of the journey and the us as an apprehension of who the Lord is leaves us, I think, with a rather different understanding from Rachel's of what a creed like Nicaea is for. It's not so much about how a nebulous we invite each other on a shared journey to an indeterminate destination. It's about how we collectively respond to the Lord's invitation to be with him on the mountain. It's our bold yes to God's self-revelation. So I want to use my time to make three short points. The first about the purpose of the creeds, the second about language, the third about human beings and how God uses them. First, creeds. Why did the early church spend so much time writing creeds? In order to provide a coherent account of truth and a sufficient form of words to enable us to know the Lord and find the way to his mountain. Creeds are therefore necessarily limiting. They outline the parameters of how the Lord is revealing himself to the community. They set boundaries to theological speculation. Is that exclusionary? Well, yes and no. Far from undermining unity and promoting schism, creedalism has an important unifying function. The Nicene description of the Lord and his house, towards which Christian pilgrims journey, is precisely the kind of focus a broken body requires to unify it as together constituting the art of the psalm. And secondly, the invitation nature of the psalm holds true also for creedal identity. One freely submits to creeds. They're not an imposed hindrance. One is free to constrain one's theology, practice, and worship within creedal orthodoxy, and thus identify oneself with the ars of creedal Christianity, or not. Creeds are also, however, liberating. There's an old social experiment where a group of children are placed in a playground without fences. Their play gravitates towards the center of the playground and around the adult. Conversely, when set in a playground with fences, the children spread far and wide, exploring the whole arena of play. In the same way, the creed provides a bounded space within which Christians can speculate and experiment without undermining their own salvation or that of others. Then second, language. Rachel seems a little suspicious of the adequacy of language and words in conveying truth about God. She is, of course, correct to say that the revelation of God's own self in Jesus cannot be contained exhaustively in any form of words. But that's not to say that it cannot be revealed truly. Claiming to know a truth coherently is not the same thing as claiming to know it totally and exhaustively. Creedal formulations presuppose that we can know God truly, if not totally. Indeed, perhaps the very reason God has given us the gift of language is to describe him and praise him. And then third, human beings. Throughout Rachel's paper, there's a slight distaste about the process of the Council of Nicaea. She refers to its membership, its power plays, the role of the emperor, and so on. And this, she appears to suggest, renders it less adequate as a vehicle for revealing divine truth. I'd want to suggest the opposite is the case. The whole story of the scriptures is about the way in which God reveals truth through broken, useless, sinful people. Moses the murderer, David the adulterer, Rahab the sex worker, the faithless kings of Israel, the feckless, useless disciples. These sinful people, filled with pride and ego, are God's medium. Through them he conveys the precious truths of the gospel. And surely that's the story of the Nicaea. Honest disagreement in love. I'm not sure it was all that honest. I'm not sure it always was in love. Of course there was power, politics and power play and compromise because we're human beings. But it's precisely through a wounded body that the wounded Lord speaks and reveals his truth. And surely that's what we find in the creeds. Sinful human beings to whom the truth of God is revealed, that we might believe it and be saved. And personally, I'm glad that's how God works, because I'm a useless sinner too. But despite that, perhaps because of that, I'm still fit to invite people to the house of the Lord, that together we might recite, we believe in one God, and in so doing, find salvation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Philip. The rich responding goes on. Bishop Paul Hendricks from the Archdiocese of Southwark. Bishop Paul, we're delighted you're here.
Thanks. Thanks, Peter. So I'm grateful to Rachel for giving us a very stimulating talk, which offers some interesting avenues to explore. I like the way she begins by making explicit the question of our own personal starting point, which is a response to an invitation coming ultimately from God, but mediated through others. They said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. I heard, recognized that this was also my faith, and I responded with joy. Each one of us hears this call, is drawn to it, responds, and so reinterprets it, as Rachel said. And this suggests to me that some of the differences between us may not necessarily arise from an unwillingness to accept current orthodoxy at any given stage of the Church's history. They may in some cases arise from personal appropriation of tradition, different reflections of what has been received, in some cases. Rachel recognizes, of course, there are more serious disagreements which really do divide us. It seems to me, though, that this may not be because the alternative position is simply false, but sometimes because it is inadequate. What Arianism says positively about Christ is true, but it falls short of what we take as orthodoxy because of what it denies about him, namely that he is true God as well as truly human. Often it can happen that a false teaching about Christ has its origin in an intention to safeguard what I might call the complementary teaching, which is in itself true. To put it very simply, Arius denied the full divinity of Christ to safeguard his full humanity. To take another example, as a Catholic, I cannot agree with the 31st of the 39 articles, that the sacrifices of masses are blasphemous fables and dangerous deceits. At the same time, I accept the truth that I take this article is intended to uphold, that the offering of Christ once made is that perfect redemption, propitiation, and satisfaction for all the sins of the world. I often wonder whether many of the teachings that divide us could be reconciled, at least to a large extent, or at least better understood, if we considered the truths that they affirm rather than what they deny. I find Rachel's observations about the context of Nicaea very helpful, recognizing that the participants had until very recently been living through violent and uncertain times. To some extent, I presume that different Christian identities, as I think she says, had indeed been formed in response to this situation. All the same, I think it's important to recognize that the need to reconcile doctrinal conflicts doesn't arise, it seems to me, until the relevant question has been articulated and become the subject of dispute. It's that very important that everything changes once a question has been articulated in a certain way and therefore requires a response. Until then, it's not particularly an issue because no one's thought of it. In other words, I'm not convinced that the different points of view expressed at Nicaea were the results of long-established competing traditions, which isn't necessarily what you were saying. Finally, I agree that power is bound to be a factor given the role of the emperor. I would also say that Rachel is right to question the assumption that's often made, not by her, that power is the determining factor. As she says, it seems more credible that everyone involved was both sincerely believing and out for their own interests, at least some of the time.
Thank you, Bishop Paul. I'm going to invite now Dr. Victoria Turner. Now, let me get this correct. It's not on my notes, so it's the Scottish Episcopal Theological Institute. Is that closest? Yes, my apologies, not getting it correctly. Victoria.
I want to think of the incarnation as God's pilgrimage. When people ask you questions about your own pilgrimage, they usually focus on the destination. I went on a 4-day pilgrimage to the Isle of Iona, walking from Oban across the island of Mull. And though, of course, there was a lot of celebration when we got to Iona, but not that much because we were still camping, and I hate camping, especially on Scottish islands. The most important parts of that pilgrimage came unexpectedly. Perhaps some of the best theology that has been inspired by the Council's Creed has come about quite unexpectedly too. Susan Derber, who is our current president of the WCC, wrote an article reflecting on Nicaea and her own movement in response to it. I was really taken by Derber's reading of Nicaea as proclaiming both God as Father and as Mother, in essence, if not directly in terms. She writes, "The Father is one who begets, one who through love brings life into being. And as such, begetting implies and needs motherhood as much as fatherhood. In this creed, the fatherhood is associated with creation, with begetting, with birthing. It is father not as teacher or guide or ruler, but as the source of life." These bishops managed to, almost, balance their language, even before inclusive language was sexy. I don't know what our excuse is. But I find it illuminating how God speaks to all through our collective witness, even when all do not have a seat at the table. The desired destination of Nicaea indeed may have been clouded with grubby politics. Love that phrase. I think often our ecumenical conversations today are clouded with grubby politics, a narrow idea of evangelization that does not wish us to be changed by those whom become included, a desire to once again have a dangerous kind of power that proclaims without listening, a vision of unity that squishes out diversity or does not let go of certainties. Our mysterious, unpredictable God does not aid us in these games. Instead, God turns our attention to weakness, to the beauty of birth. Our society doesn't like this element of surprise. It likes algorithms, the certainty of AI, the entrenchment of groups into closed boxes. This is also infecting our ecumenical movement, where we can often walk on eggshells around each other to preserve the celebration instead of moving our attention towards lifting up the lowly to where God is residing. Those who met in Nicaea discerned that power was not God's aim, but meekness and humility. They also discerned that God was Holy One, not leaving room for any divine proclamations from any important emperors. So the message that came from this community, recovering, broken, and shattered, was not the ultimate celebration of God's defeat of death from the cross. Indeed, the original creed only mentioned the suffering of Christ and that he rose again. But instead, it concentrated on the incarnation and the miracle of God's birth. When we imagine the conclusion of our pilgrimage, let us recall God birthing God from Mary, under occupation and vulnerable. We're called not to be the privileged, but to gather power through witness to God's presence, or God's pilgrimage, with us, in us and through us in the world, and maybe even beyond us too.
Thank you, Victoria. And our final panellist, the Reverend Canon Dr. Jeremy Morris, the National Ecumenical Officer for the Church of England. Still? Yes.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's a thing about, sitting on these panels, the further you are down the pecking order, the less you have to say, because you hear everything and you think, well, I agree with that. So I could just say I agree and then sit down. But I'm enormously grateful to Rachel for a really stimulating, thought-provoking paper. I suppose respondents from a different Christian tradition from her own might be expected to pick up on substantial areas of disagreement between us. But that's difficult, actually, because there's so much in what she said with which I do agree. And that's surely the point, if we're thinking about the ecumenical potential of the celebration of Nicaea, We speak out of a common Christian conviction. We believe in one God. We're not substantially at odds with each other, I suspect, on what we believe about God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The tragedy of divided Christendom is not that the disagreements run all the way through from top to bottom, but that we agree about pretty well all the things that are absolutely at the core of our faith. And in the end, that is what the Creed of Nicaea is attempting to express. Our disagreements are real and not trivial in human terms, but they are marginal when considered against the great Christological truths at the heart of our faith. So I will pick up just a few points, largely of agreement, and respond to them. Like Rachel, I'd begin with joy and gladness. Jesus says in John 10:10, I am come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Abundant life is the life in Christ, a life filled with love, focused on love, shared in love with all around us, even those who seek to harm us. And although Rachel and I would surely disagree about the place of creeds in the life of the church, still, even speaking from a tradition, the Anglican tradition, which puts creeds into our liturgy, our regular worship, I would say that the attempt to express what faith is in words, in statements, is valueless if the core experience of joy and peace and love is not there in the first place. That is what must always come first. Second, those very powerful words about the broken body and the experience of martyrdom. One can, of course, transpose those words to the church itself as Christ's broken body, for the church is broken through its own divisions. Let's not forget that many of the martyrs, and Rachel alluded to this, many of the martyrs of the past were murdered by Christians, or those who claim to be Christian, in the conflicts of the Reformation, in the wars between East and West, and even today in wars in parts of the world. Nicaea was an attempt to find a way in which churches from across the world could be the church. And in the church, there is no place for conflict, for harm. So I agree that recognizing shared suffering is an important step towards peace and unity. That encompasses our divisions in history, which is why the search for Christian unity is central to the way we live the gospel today, not a luxury or extra. So finally, how do we avoid all this tipping over into a corrupt, pseudo-Christian will to power? Part of the answer to that is what, in the modern age, we've come to call democratic accountability. We can have rulers, leaders, structures with levels and degrees of responsibility, hierarchies of bishops, all of that, but we must have a shared sense of mutual responsibility and consultation. In other words, a conciliar and collegial way of deciding things and working together. Nicaea was a very imperfect model of this, admittedly. But at its core is the very simple idea that Christians, to resolve their differences, must meet together, speak and listen under the guidance of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Jeremy. And 1700 years later, we are still with passion and excitement discussing this faith that we share together. Thanks be to God. We are running out of time, but we do have time for some questions. But these are specifically identified questions. Isn't that right, Anton? So the first question, Stephen Cooper from the Methodist Church. Would you like to ask your question, please? Now, that's a very interesting question, and we don't have time for everyone to answer. So maybe it's a huge sigh of relief that nobody... would anybody of the panel particularly have a burning answer to that question, including Rachel? Well, perhaps we'll hear from Rachel first, and then we'll hear from Bishop Philip, yes. Rachel. Oh, I see.
It seemed appropriate to answer that as a member of an established church where the king is the supreme governor and where bishops are appointed by prime ministers, which is madly frustrating on many levels and feels outdated and constricting. If you're wondering why it's taking 45,000 times longer to elect an Archbishop of Canterbury than a pope, that's part of the reason. Where it's a good thing, though, is the responsibility that establishment gives us for a nation. So the cure of souls is absolutely perhaps the key identifying feature of the Church of England, that by law we're required to have the well-being, the spiritual care of every single person who lives in a parish in England, and that's every single person. And I think that responsibility is very challenging, but also very determining of the Church of England's mission and the responsibility it feels to a nation. So bits of it, it's a very good question about state intervention. Bits of it, I have to say, are madly frustrating. But the responsibility it gives us for everyone is I think, quite formative. It's defining of Anglicanism.
Andrew?
It seems to me that the state is interested in the church if it thinks the church is any use. If it thinks that through the church it could get anywhere, it will be deeply interested in what the church is doing. But the situation in England at the moment is that the state knows perfectly well that it doesn't matter what the church does, and they're not interested. Really not interested. And in some ways, it is more difficult to cope with the state being uninterested in the church than it is to cope with the state that is either in favor of it or against it.
Rachel? The daft thing is we were warned about the questions and I hadn't thought this one through. I think there's a question about power, right? And which in different contexts is going to vary. Who has the capacity to make what happen, right? So there's convening. One can imagine situations in which certain public authorities have a kind of convening power that specific church groups don't have of their own, which, yeah, okay, sometimes does help, because this says, say locally, right? I've seen this happen, right? A local politician or whatever can say, I want to hear from all the faith communities about such a thing. We can call them together. We can actually have state, if you like, motivation to act together for the good of the city, which leads to certain, which advances the mission of the church, right? So that, if you like, is the state advancing the church's mission, and it's also ends up being ecumenical interfaith, so on and so forth. This can happen. I mean, that seems a bit banal, doesn't it? Because we were all rather carried away with the glitz and gold of Byzantium. But I know there's a lot of talk about local ecumenical activity going on here. So I think my answer is, if you want to look for where the interesting cooperation of public authorities and churches is going on, maybe locally and regionally, here and now is the place to be looking. Globally, of course, it's a million different pictures, right? So go to any country in the world, ask the question differently. But if you want a local answer, that's my local answer.
Thank you. We could talk all day about that question, and I'd like to offer my point of view, but I'm going to hold back because we have our next question from Tracy, from the Salvation Army.
If Nicaea 325 was
Would anyone like to? Victoria, let's come to the microphone so we can
I'll
hear.
say something in a minute if I can.
Sorry.
I find this question really, really interesting, and I almost want to contradict myself in how I respond to it. The first sense, I think it's a false illusion for us to think that the Council of Nicaea wasn't at all about humanity. All theology is contextual. There is no contextual-less theology. There's only a homogenized idea of theology which represents a certain kind of person that believes they have a universal experience. On the other hand, when I think of what does it mean in humanity, I do think the more we understand about humanity, the more we understand about God, because God reveals God's self through all of us, in our communities and through our world. Yet, in our current society, I think we need to be more wary of idolatry. And I think there's a lot of worship of self in the sense of kind of both performative and in how we live and economic worth. And I think this is something that the church needs to be more prophetic in speaking against. And then, a third thing that brings me to this question, I think we need to turn away from ideas of humanity in the sense of individualism, which is where society is trying to kind of hone in on, and think about humanity in the sense of how structures are inhibiting us. So how we actually can't fulfill our God-given humanity because we are strangled by sinful structures. Yet again, the church doesn't want to be prophetic and talk about that.
I'll take Jeremy next, and then we'll. Yeah.
Thank you. That's it. I mean, it's a really interesting question. It's a very difficult question, and has lots of kind of dimensions. But the one I think I would, and I'm obviously speaking from a church, the kind of Church of England, that is, on one view, tearing itself apart over questions of anthropology and how. I mean, I think if you tried to do what the question suggests, you will simply end up with something that looks like the kinds of arguments we're having in our General Synod today. The Church of England is playing out these conflicts about the nature of theological anthropology, what it means to be human, what, in a sense, our vocation is before God in the way we treat each other, the way we relate to each other, I mean, sexually as well as in other ways. And I just don't think, I'm afraid, there's a shortcut to that. So I fear that, I mean, I think a better way of looking at it, or a way of looking at it sometimes that I think I have to persuade myself it's important to hold on to, is that in the church we are at least trying to have serious arguments about these things and not running away from it, even though it's very painful and may not, and certainly will not, lead to a kind of resolution that pleases everyone. But I'm afraid I don't think there is a Nicaea 2025 or whatever that will help us to resolve that particular question in a way that we're not already trying to do.
Rachel, could you come over? Could you come here? It's a little easier to hear from this microphone, I think.
I really appreciate the question. I'm grateful for the opportunity to advertise the public free availability of all the papers produced by the World Council of Churches Faith and Order Commission, which has had a long and complex series of exercises on interconnected issues in theological anthropology and in moral discernment. It's been, as they say in the trade, a bit of a nightmare, but so the new commission has a group on theological anthropology. One of our main working groups is on theological anthropology, precisely for the reasons that you're saying, that there's a will to look at the things that the churches are actually tearing themselves apart over. It's just, as Jeremy's rightly said, it's, actually I want to combine Victoria's responses and Jeremy's. There's an enormous amount that the world really needs to hear about what it is to be human, that actually the churches are in a position to speak about. And it's speaking about God as well as about humanity always together. So to speak theologically about humanity is really important. There's loads we can say. And if you tell people you're going to talk about theological anthropology, they assume you're going to have a big fight about sexuality. And it's really tiring, and it's really tempting just to run away from it, and I want to really affirm the folk that aren't. So in between those, so yeah, keep an eye out, watch this space, watch World Council of Churches space. There is ongoing work, and please, I really want folks to pay attention to the work that's being done in the huge, like Jeremy's been saying, these huge areas of agreement, and pray for those who are trying to head for the areas of disagreement. Thank you.
I love all the passion that we have in all these responses and presentations. One more question from Tim from the Church of England. You're going to come up to the front, Tim. And we've got 2 minutes to answer that question, friends. I wonder if Bishop Paul, would you like to offer a reflection on that?
I suppose the question that comes to my mind is, what do we mean by full communion? If we mean simply that we all agree to exchange the Eucharist, with each other, then, that could in principle be very simple. But of course, not all the churches, including my own, actually agree that that's possible unless we have full communion in the sense of a sufficient consensus on what we believe about Christ, about the church, the sort of fundamental teachings of the sort that is in Nicaea and subsequent councils. But I think we have to put on one side the question of, can we foresee the circumstances which could lead to that full communion, that genuine full communion, and place ourselves in the hands of God, because ultimately it's God's work, not ours. And the one thing I would say is that it's absolutely vital that we don't lose sight of that ultimate goal, however difficult it might be to envisage how that might come about. In an ecumenical dialogue over the years, I hear a lot about diversity, which is a good thing in many ways, but it seems to me that where it is division rather than simple diversity of gifts, then that is something which is an obstacle to unity. And I don't think we can accept that. I don't think we can be just complacent and pretend it doesn't exist, but to continue to work to understand each other better, to understand the nuances of each other's faith, and to really get to grips with the things that mean such a lot to all of us, to put ourselves in the position of the other people that we dialogue with, to see things from their point of view, and to hopefully gradually come to a greater and greater understanding. And having done that, we simply have to leave it in the hands of God, because ultimately it is God's work and not ours.
I just wonder, Sister Margaret, would you like to offer anything, as you haven't spoken in this panel discussion, but don't feel you have to? Okay. I think on that, on that note, I think we're going to have to draw to a close. These conversations are carrying on tomorrow for those who have been involved in tomorrow's programmes. I would just like to say what a very rich time we've had together, immensely rich, and proves that as we move towards the last sort of quarter of this year, so many conversations around this important anniversary, how vibrant and exciting these ecumenical conversations are. and will continue to be. So my thanks to Anton, to James, and to all those who've worked on this, and to our panel, thank you very much, and most of all to Rachel for her very stimulating lecture, and we look forward to reading the text and digesting it in much more greater detail and depth. Thank you all very much, and thank you for being here.